the early years of this century, the British Royal Navy introduced a revolutionary new type of battleship. They were known as Dreadnoughts. Huge, turbine-powered, ironclad warships with the biggest guns ever to engage in battle on the high seas. They made the Royal Navy the masters of the world's oceans. At about the same time, Marconi had invented wireless telegraphy, or radio. So now aboard the new ships, there was a new duty, the wireless operator, who kept the ships of the fleet, steaming the distant seas, in constant touch with their commanders at the Admiralty, here in Whitehall, London. Within a few years, radio was adopted by all the world's major navies, particularly the US and the German high seas fleets. It meant that their warships could range far and wide across the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Indian Oceans, acting as powerful instruments of colonial power, always precisely controlled by their masters in Washington and Berlin and London. Prior to radio, it's worth recalling, the only way to send a message to or from a fleet at sea was to send it by ship, which might take several weeks. Radio transformed the role of fleets at sea. But there was a downside to the use of radio. It posed a grave threat to security. Anybody with a receiver, friend or foe, could pick up the secret signals and read their enemy's intentions.
Radio, or wireless telegraphy, when it came into being at the turn of the century, turned out to be a great boon for navies. It enabled operational headquarters to control ships far away at sea. But radio had an enormous disadvantage in comparison to this advantage. Namely, it turned over every message that it sent to the enemy. How were they to eliminate this leakage of information? They began to use codes and ciphers to protect them. But on the other side, the enemy, to gain access to this information, developed code breaking, and it became, in World War I, for the first time, an important instrument of war.
It was the beginning of the War of the Codebreakers that has gone on ever since. The German Navy signals were picked up in London in code as a meaningless jumble of letters and figures. It was a completely new problem for the Royal Navy. So they began to train a handful of men in this difficult trade. And then they had a huge stroke of luck.
In the very early days of the war, the captain of a German warship made an elementary mistake, and it changed the course of the entire war. The cruiser Magdeburg was part of the German Baltic Fleet and was ordered to lay mines off a Latvian seaport and then, together with another warship and some fast torpedo boats, sail north to attack shipping, Russian shipping, in the Gulf of Finland. On the 23rd of August 1914, so just 2 weeks into the war, this little flotilla ran into dense sea mist just off the Russian coast. Now, the navigator on board the Magdeburg was very confident. He knew his position. He was mistaken. He was just 1 mile off course, but it was enough. In a flat, calm sea, enveloped in sea mist, steaming at 15 knots, the Magdeburg ran aground on the little Russian island of Oldensholm in the mouth of the Gulf of Finland. Its war had come to an untimely end. When the Russians arrived next morning, the Magdeburg lay high and dry. The captain and crew had made desperate attempts to scuttle the warship and destroy all secret documents. But very rapidly, Russian Navy divers recovered from the shallow waters around the ill-fated warship a priceless haul, no less than a copy of the principal codebook of the Imperial German Navy.
The Russians passed this precious codebook to Britain, and it ended up in room 40 of the old Admiralty building in London. A small group of Navy intelligence officers had been set up by Winston Churchill at the outbreak of the war. And from this small beginning, room 40 was to become one of the most vital sources of intelligence in the devious history of codebreaking.
Now, the Magdeburg codebook had no less than 34,000 groups made up of letters or figures, each of which represented key words or actions. So, for example, when the group ODI was sent by radio, it meant action stations. When the group GUK was sent, again by radio, it meant ram the enemy flagship. I doubt if that was used very often. But remarkably, despite the fate of the Magdeburg and the very real possibility that codes had been compromised, they remained unchanged. It meant essentially giving the British a dictionary to enable them to read secret German naval commands and orders. It meant that British intelligence often knew about German naval intentions at the same time as the German naval captains themselves.
That was the case in May of 1916. It was the moment of truth, a turning point in the war. The codebreakers learned that the massive German high seas fleet, commanded by Admiral Reinhard Scheer, leading over 100 warships, was setting out to smash the stranglehold of the Royal Navy's dreadnoughts in the North Sea. That was a formidable task. The Royal Navy was by far the largest and most powerful navy in the world. It had been created on what was called the two-power principle. It had to be greater than any two foreign navies combined. Moreover, it was at the cutting edge of technology. It had made the transition from slow lumbering battleships to the fast turbine-powered dreadnoughts. The mighty fleet lay secure in deep and heavily protected anchorages along Britain's northeastern coast, and there was no doubt about its toughness. Life for naval crews was harsh in the extreme, and discipline was severe. In that respect, little had changed since Nelson's day. But morale was high right across the fleet. They were itching to get to grips with the enemy so close at hand, on the other side of the North Sea. However, there was one major question mark. The Royal Navy hadn't fought a major fleet battle since Nelson's distant triumph at Trafalgar. They could dance the hornpipe now, but might they dance a less jaunty step to the music of the German guns?
Germany was being starved into submission by the blockade in the North Sea set up by the British Royal Navy. Now, the British Royal Navy had two main fleets, the Grand Fleet of mighty dreadnoughts, mainly here at Scapa Flow in the Orkneys, under the command of the somewhat introspective and withdrawn Admiral Jellicoe. Further south at Rosyth, on the Firth of Forth, there was the fleet of fast and deadly battle cruisers under the command of the charismatic Admiral Beatty. On the other side of the North Sea was the entire German high seas fleet at Wilhelmshaven on the Jade River under the command of Admiral Scheer. Now, the Germans intended to spring a trap. In simple terms, it was as follows. A fleet of fast battle cruisers would set to sea under Admiral Hipper as if to bombard British coastal towns. When Admiral Beatty came out with his battle fleet to respond, the trap would be sprung. The entire weight of the German high seas fleet, sailing just 50 miles astern, would be thrown against Admiral Beatty's battle cruisers to annihilate them. Now, the plan depended upon the fact that the British would know what was going on so late. It would be too late for the dreadnoughts under Admiral Jellicoe to take part in the action. And the destruction of Admiral Beatty's ships would cancel out the British advantage of numbers in the North Sea. When Jellicoe's dreadnoughts did get into the action, the German accurate gunners would wreak such heavy damage that Britain again would never be able to establish the blockade. Now, that was the plan. It was a good one. It had one flaw, and that was that the codebreakers in Room 40 knew about it within a matter of days of it being transmitted by radio to the German naval captains.
On the 29th of May 1916, Room 40 was able to advise the Chief of War Staff, Vice Admiral Sir Henry Oliver, that the German high seas fleet was about to put to sea. Admirals Jellicoe and Beatty were advised that the German fleet would put to sea on the 31st of May. The British now had a huge opportunity to destroy the German fleet once and for all, because of the codebreakers' skill. It turned out to be an opportunity thrown away before even a shot was fired. The coded call sign of the German flagship was DK. However, when the flagship left harbour, the call sign DK was assigned to a shore-based radio station, and the battleship adopted a totally different secret call sign. All this was done in order to confuse the British eavesdroppers. But the British codebreakers were not deceived. They knew all about this ruse and used radio direction finding to listen to the German ships and track their actual movements. So on the 31st of May 1916, they knew that the mighty German high seas fleet had put to sea on a mission of destruction.
However, there was a problem of human relations. The senior naval officers at the British Admiralty had a very low regard indeed, to put it no stronger, for the junior naval officers and the civilians even who fought their war in Room 40 with bits of paper and code books. So when on that fateful day in May 1916 a senior naval commander came to Room 40 to ask the key question, what is the location of call sign DK, he was given the technically correct answer, DK is still on the Jade River. Relations between the naval officers and the codebreakers were so bad that no other questions were asked, no other information was volunteered, to the effect, of course, that the ships themselves were now on the high seas and racing towards the British shore. In that single moment, the massive codebreaking advantage was thrown away, and what followed was a chapter of disasters and missed opportunities.
Believing that the Germans were still in harbour, Admiral Jellicoe steamed his grand fleet from the further Forth and Scapa Flow at economical speed to conserve fuel, as he awaited news of the German fleet setting sail, before speeding to link up with Admiral Beatty's heavy cruisers which had sailed from Rosyth. Meanwhile, Beatty was amazed to discover that afternoon that he'd steamed almost into the guns of the advance guard of the German battleships. Beatty turned north to draw the German fleet onto Jellicoe's guns. But in the next half hour, he lost 3 warships to excellent German gunnery. The Indefatigable, the Queen Mary, and the Invincible, when the magazine was hit, which blew the ship to pieces. She sank with all hands. This was the cause of Admiral Beatty's celebrated remark to his flag lieutenant, "There's something wrong with our bloody ships, Chatfield." As night fell, the frustrated British commanders searched for the elusive German fleet without success. Next day, the Germans escaped back to the safety of the River Jade. The Battle of Jutland, the first and the last engagement between these mighty dreadnought ships, was over. The Royal Navy lost 3 battle cruisers, 3 cruisers, 8 destroyers, and 6,274 officers and men. The German losses were lighter: 1 battleship, 1 cruiser, 4 light cruisers, 5 destroyers, and just 2,545 officers and men. It was a tactical defeat for the Royal Navy, but it was also a strategic victory. The High Seas Fleet never sailed from the River Jade again, except when it surrendered in 1918. The Battle of Jutland was an object lesson. Intelligence, however good, is only a means to an end, not an end in itself. If all the codebreakers' intercepts had been acted on promptly and relied on by the admirals at sea, the outcome could have been very different. Winston Churchill described Admiral Jellicoe as the only man on either side who could have lost the war in an afternoon. Without the codebreakers of Room 40, he could well have done so. When the British ships returned to harbour with their wounded, there was no triumphal welcome. The British public and the press demanded a scapegoat. It could only be Jellicoe. The quiet, grave little man had always held himself remote from press and publicity. Within 6 months of the battle, he was moved away from his beloved Dreadnoughts to a desk at the Admiralty. His place was taken by the dashing Admiral Beatty, ironically the man who'd lost most men and most battleships in the brief skirmish, but also the man who, rightly or wrongly, had won the highest praise. But with the Battle of Jutland lost, the war slipped deeper into stalemate, with millions of men trapped in trenches facing each other across the battle-scarred mud of northern France. But once again, the codebreakers broke the stalemate with what has been called the most important intercept of the entire war. It came from an unusual source. One of the first acts carried out by the Royal Navy when war started was to locate the German underwater transatlantic telegraph cables, which were promptly lifted and cut. That immediately forced Germany to use radio for its transatlantic messages, which the British eavesdroppers in London could intercept. However, beneath the streets of Edwardian London, there were still the cables of neutral Sweden and America. Top secret German messages were sent on them. Although it broke all international conventions, the codebreakers tapped into these cables. On Wednesday, the 17th of January 1917, they struck pure gold. Blinker Hall, the British officer in charge of Room 40, described the event afterwards. "I'm not likely to forget that Wednesday morning. There was the usual docket of papers to be gone through on my arrival at the office. I was still working on them when at about 10:30, de Grey came in. He seemed excited. 'Sir, do you want to bring America into the war?' 'Yes, my boy,' I answered. 'Why?' 'I've got something here which might do the trick.' The something was a German diplomatic telegram sent by Germany's foreign minister in Berlin, Arthur Zimmermann, to the German ambassador Bernstorff in Washington. 'Most secret, for your Excellency's personal information, and to be handed on to the Imperial Minister of Mexico by a safe route. We propose to begin on the 1st of February unrestricted submarine warfare. In doing so, however, we shall endeavour to keep America neutral. If we should not, we propose to Mexico an alliance upon the following basis: joint conduct of war, joint conclusion of peace, regain lost territory in Texas, New Mexico and Arizona. Your Excellency should for the present inform the President of Mexico secretly that we expect war with the USA. Our submarines expect to compel England to peace in a few months. Acknowledge, Zimmermann.' The content of the cable was explosive. Germany was revealing that it was about to use the U-boats to sink any ship of any nation, including American ships, they intercepted on the high seas. Worse still, Germany was inviting Mexico into a war against still neutral America with the promise of huge territorial gains. The cable was dynamite. If handled properly and passed to President Wilson without revealing that British agents were tapping neutral Swedish and American, indeed anyone's cables they could get into, then the President would have little choice but to bring America into the war. The stalemate on the Western Front would be broken, and the British Allies were bound to sweep on to victory. The full text was passed to President Wilson early in 1917, with a cover story that it had been intercepted after it reached Mexico. In April 1917, President Wilson brought America into the war against Germany. The result was decisive. The arrival of thousands of fresh American soldiers with unlimited supplies broke the stalemate on the Western Front and swept the Allies on to victory. In November 1918, although not a single inch of its territory had been occupied, Germany capitulated. It brought to an end what had been the most violent war in all of human history. The blunders of the politicians and the generals had led to the destruction of an entire generation of British, French, and German youth in the mud of northern France. The whole Western world went wild, rejoicing at the end of the war to end all wars. The codebreakers had proved to be the decisive secret weapon.
The Zimmermann telegram was the most important single code solution in history. It demonstrated an absolutely brilliant use of intelligence by Admiral Hall. Its importance, of course, was that it precipitated America into the Great War on the side of the Allies. And for the first time, intelligence had had a significant effect on the course of world events.
Not long after the end of hostilities, Winston Churchill, who had been First Lord of the Admiralty, revealed in his memoirs just how important a role the codebreakers of Room 40 had played. German commanders were stunned that their signals had been penetrated. Nowhere did that message strike home more forcefully than in the mind of a young U-boat commander, Karl Dönitz, who was to command the entire U-boat fleet in World War II. He had seen just how close the U-boats had come to breaking the naval blockade. He determined at that moment that never again would Germany's naval codes be broken. For the USA too, the exploits of Britain's Room 40 had proved their war-winning power. A young and brilliant American codebreaker named Herbert Yardley had been sent across to gain experience from the British. He returned to Washington to play a central role in America's top-secret code-breaking operations against the Japanese. But that's another story.